Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Colin, for that wonderful prayer. And it's just as you were praying, I was thinking, isn't that the story of our church? And churches throughout the world is we go through deaths and weddings and adversity and paving parking lots and all these different things. As you were praying, I was thinking back when I was administrative pastor on all those different types of things that we would encounter in our church. And really, that is the story of our church. And my hope is for the folks who are joining us virtually that you are a part of that story. And my hope is that you'll be able to join us physically here. It's great to see many more folks that can come into our midst in our sanctuary. We're delighted to have you, and we're also delighted to continue to have Pastor Yad and Linda, who have been with us and braved this time with us every time we've been able to come. So we are so grateful to be in your midst. Our virtual congregation, our hope is that you'll be able to join us. There's plenty of seats, plenty of space, and things, as Colin has prayed, have been kept pretty safe, and we offer a praise to the Lord for that. The Christian world comes together today, right, to celebrate Palm Sunday. And so as I was looking at the messages that we've been going through in the book of Luke, and I've entitled these series of messages as destinations of what he wants for us to do, I got into Luke, and I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be appropriate to kind of skip ahead in our sequence to be able to talk about Palm Sunday? Because I actually do have, within my message series on Luke, a message on Palm Sunday. And so that's what I'm doing today. I apologize for those who follow us sequentially, because we won't. We'll jump several chapters ahead, and then next time I'm here, we'll jump back. Okay? Because I thought it was appropriate to give you this message on Palm Sunday. So with that in mind, let's look at the passage. Okay. Starts in Luke chapter 19, verse 32. It says, "So those who were sent left and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owner said to them, 'Why are you untying the colt? The Lord needs it,' they said. Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their clothes on the colt, they had helped Jesus get on it. As he was going along, they were spreading their clothes on the road. Now he came near the path down the Mount of Olives, and the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles they had seen. 'Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven.'" May God's word be blessed today. As we look at this passage, a couple of things I just wanted to point out. And Colin gave an excellent background on this when the service started. And so I don't want to duplicate that in any manner. But there's something that's characteristic about this passage in Luke versus the other passages, which actually Palm Sunday is found in every gospel. And what's characteristic about this passage is, did you notice there was no mention of palms in there? The other thing I also wanted to point out as we think about that, and let me finish. Some of the Pharisees from the crowd told him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." He answered, "I tell you, if they were to keep silent, the stones would cry out." Now today I wanted to be able to entitle this message based on a characteristic that, as we look at Palm Sunday, for those of you who have ever been to a Palm Sunday message, usually it's talking about the triumphant entry of Jesus, and how he reigns as king, and how he is celebrated in such a way. Now, all the points that I'm going to be sharing with you are found in this QR code, so my hope is that if you raise your phone and attempt to take a picture, that it will take you to the link of the message notes. And if it doesn't work, I apologize. We'll fix it in the future to make sure it works. The best thing to do now, I'm starting to see, is just take a picture of the slides as they come up. But as I think about this passage, allow me to be able to summarize it this way. Like I said, it is in all the Gospels. It is listed consistently in all the Gospels. And there are only two other instances where this happens. This, what we call the triumphal entry, and the feeding of the 5,000. Those are actually the only two that show up in all four. But there's something that's unique about what we see here in Luke. So it's often referred to as Palm Sunday. But did you notice in Luke, there's no mention of the palms? And the reason why there's no mention of the palms for Palm Sunday, even though it's the passage on Palm Sunday, is that Luke was writing to a group of people who were not Jews. They were Gentiles. Okay, so it didn't make sense, as Colin had pointed out, this was something, the uniqueness of palms had to do with the Jewish culture. So to be able to describe it as Palm Sunday to a bunch of folks that are not Jews didn't make any sense to them. Okay, and so as much as we call it Palm Sunday, as much as the other passages refer to palms, Luke doesn't. The second thing that we see, and I want to share with you something that I've seen that kind of weaves through. What do we learn about Palm Sunday? We learn that Jesus is King. What's the message that we take away as the characteristic that we need to uphold, that he practices during Palm Sunday? And this is the first thing I see, is that Jesus tells two disciples to go to the village ahead, okay? We didn't read that passage, but it's there. Okay, basically he tells them, go and get a colt. Jesus instructs them on what to say. Not only does Jesus instruct them on what to say, the owner consents to the request of the disciples, but ultimately, I think it's in recognition of the Lord. And then what we see is the people responding to the need of Jesus' safety by spreading their coats. So we often say, well, they were laying down palms, right? But what we see here that is actually described more so is the idea that the coats, their garments, were laid down so that the road would be smooth, basically looking after Jesus' safety, because if what would happen if the colt were to trip, we would see that he could fall, Jesus would fall. Okay, so I wonder if that was the case. The other things that we see, and I just wanted to point these out and then give you some points after this, is that the people celebrated Jesus' entry. And as we talk about Palm Sunday, this is meant to be a celebration of Jesus as King. But we see that through the Holy Week, it turns very much so. The disciples were leading the cheers and respect, as Colin again pointed out, Psalm 119, the whole idea of the song that was being sang, but also cheers were also being presented as well. And it was the disciples that were leading those cheers. Now, for those of you who have ever been to a Bay Area sports competition with our professional sports teams that are here in the Bay Area, you might have recalled, if you attended any of those many years ago, a guy named Crazy George. Crazy George was a guy that had very little hair on top, but a lot of hair on the side, and it was amazing what he did. Was that he had this little drum, and I remember in the early days of Oakland A's games, he would bang on his drum, and he would get the crowd to do things they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. In fact, if you've ever heard of something called the wave, Crazy George, I don't know if it's officially assigned to him, he was the guy that led them to, the Oakland A's crowds to be able to do the wave. And basically it was you stand at a certain point in time, and as you stand and sit down, it looks like a wave. Okay, I remember being there in those early days when Crazy George would lead everybody. It could be as many as 50,000 fans that were doing this wave. And when this was first done, way back when, I remember also watching it on TV and seeing the ball players just amused at this sight of the wave that was going on all around them. I marvel in that, because all this was orchestrated by one man. All it took was a cheerleader to be able to make all these things happen. And I think of that when I think of this part, that the disciples were in a sense orchestrating the public, the folks that were all around, to lead in the cheers for Jesus. Now, the thing that is probably not at least not apparent within the passage. But if you look in the context of Jesus in his history itself, is the fact that Jesus always denied saying that he was king, or giving any proclamation that he was king or that he was the Messiah in a public setting. Here he allows it. Okay, and so that's what I find is interesting, is that, think of it almost like this kind of stadium type of atmosphere, this celebration where people are cheering, the disciples are leading in the cheers. That was what was going on during this period, this time. But it was not just to cheer that Jesus was here, but what he would be as the King and Messiah. Notice also, though, that the Pharisees were indignant towards the disciples' perceived brash celebration. So disciples were acting like Crazy George, right? And they're like, this is not dignified to be able to do this kind of thing. So you can almost imagine, again, that sports type of atmosphere where they're like, come on, and really trying to rile up the crowd in celebration of our King and Messiah. Jesus' response actually is interesting in that he says to the Pharisees, he indicates that the disciples actually had no choice but to obey. Now, throughout this summary that I've been able to share with you about the scripture passage, I noticed something that is actually, that at least jumps out at me, and that is this whole idea of obedience. The fact that Jesus told the disciples to do something, they go and do it. They go and say to this guy who owns this cult what needs to be done. He does it. They lead, and the disciples then go and ask the crowd to be able to cheer on Jesus. They do it, and then finally when the Pharisees say, well, why are you doing this? Jesus answers by saying they have to obey. There's no choice that they have. It's just a natural outgrowth of who they are and how they've been with Jesus. And I think about that in terms of, if we think of Palm Sunday, what is Jesus asking us to do? And I think what Jesus is asking us to do on Palm Sunday is, yes, celebrate the King, but also refine the way that we practice obedience. As I was sitting down to breakfast this morning, I go through my Bible reading, and in there, I read 1 Samuel chapter 13. For those of you who don't remember what that passage was all about, it was about Saul is now king. Samuel, has now assigned him as king. The people wanted it. They rejected God as king. Samuel helps to make him a king. And in this specific passage, it really starts this whole idea where Saul kind of gets ahead of himself. Okay, they're ready to fight the Philistines in Gilgal, and Saul is waiting, like, for Samuel to come. It's like, you got to give the blessing. You got to give the blessing. You got to, to do the burnt offering. Oh, he's not coming yet. I'm just going to go ahead and do it myself. Okay, if you remember, then what happens? Samuel comes like, what have you done? And Saul says, you weren't here. So I just went ahead and started with the burnt offering. He's like, you disobeyed. And if you look through, and if you look 2 chapters over, comes the famous passage in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, where it says, obedience is better than sacrifice. And through the Old Testament, you see, weave this whole idea and practice of obedience. That's what it was all about. It was about commands that God had given, and for whether the people would or would not obey. And I think about that in terms of what Jesus was doing here with Palm Sunday. Is what is he asking us to do in terms of our practice of obedience? And I say that because often when I was growing up and looking at this passage and seeing what the disciples did and how they asked this cult owner to give over the cult, is I thought of Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi. if you remember, the Jedi mind trick, for those of you who are the Star Wars fans, and for those of you who aren't, I will describe it now. Basically, there's a scene in, what I think it's the 5th Star Wars movie, which is actually the first Star Wars movie, where Obi-Wan Kenobi has these droids in there, and the stormtroopers are at this checkpoint where they're looking for these droids, these robots. And basically, Obi-Wan Kenobi subtly says, these are not the droids you're looking for. And what ends up happening is that when he says it, the stormtroopers repeat, these are not the droids we're looking for. That all of a sudden he's implanted in their mind that, these thoughts. And I always think of that like, ooh, that's what happened in this passage in Luke chapter 19. Is that the disciples, through Jesus, had implanted this mind trick into this cult guy, the cult owner guy, saying, you must give over your cult. And they said, and they basically robotically say, I must give over the cult. That's my picture in my mind as to what, and my suspicion is that's what you're thinking as well. Is that all of a sudden they did this Christian mind trick to make it happen. But maybe it didn't happen that way. Maybe actually there was a reason why the cult owner gave it over as he did. Maybe he knew that the Messiah was coming. And there was enough explanation to say, hey, if I give over my cult, this actually makes him more valuable. Because if you didn't understand the culture at that time, basically what happens is if you were like Hertz rent a cult, okay, basically what you did was if you rented to somebody that was royalty and king, that cult automatically gets set aside, okay, as like the special one. Okay, and so you don't just put it back into service to you. And then what's more was, if you recall, this colt or donkey was never rode on before, so it was not characteristic that you would give over. It's like saying, oh, I own a rent-a-car company, and I'm giving over my new car that hasn't been tested yet. Okay, so it's the same kind of thing. So you almost get a sense, and we'll never know until we get to heaven. You almost get a sense. Hey, maybe the cult owner actually knew who Jesus was and what he was doing. That it wasn't this mindless trick that happened that he obeyed to make this thing happen. He obeyed with information. And I say that because, as I was saying to some folks earlier, I retired this I think now this will be week 4. And if you ever ask me, am I bored? Am I ready to go back to work? No, not yet. Okay, so I mean, it's been wonderful. Okay, for those of you who don't know what retirement's like, every day is Saturday. Okay, is what it feels like. But the other thing is, as I think of the end of my career, and the end, and now I'm a grandparent, not a parent. I look at the era now, as Colin was praying, I was thinking all the things that are going on in the world, the changes that are happening, whether you call them good or bad, I don't know if they're right for me anymore. Okay, I grew up in an era that's very different than what we see now, and my suspicion is many of you have as well. Okay, you grew up in an era that was very different. Now, as I leave my workplace, what I'm seeing is they're saying, there's no longer something, and I thought it was something that was just at my company that I was working for. But I'm seeing, because I was listening to something on radio, KCBS, Brian Bandmiller, and he was saying that almost the same thing, is that nowadays they're getting rid of this idea of a manager, okay? So apparently people are supposed to work on their own without a manager. Now, I'm sure there's books. No, I know there's books and other, business consultants that have come up with this type of business model. But for me, being a guy that's now at the, finished my career, that's really foreign to me, to not have a manager. Now, I can understand the reason why that people would go this way, because for you and I'm sure we've had some bad managers in our past. I know I have. And we've learned from those type of instances, and we know what it means when a manager micromanages, okay? And when we often, I share this with my kids as well. It's like, perhaps there's something in our, because I hear them talk about work, and it's like, well, maybe there might be something in our DNA that I think I might have passed on to you, where you think every manager is less capable than you. Okay, I don't know why, and you might have a similar situation, but I've had enough bad managers in my career that I've tried to be a good one through my career as well. But what I've noticed, with this whole pervasive thing of not having a manager and everybody working on their own, for you and I, we're thinking, well, how do you get any work done if everyone is able to just be on their own? Now, there's some good things about that, is that nobody micromanages you anymore. So, I'm saying there's good and bad, but I tell you, when I think about how this is happening, and I'm seeing how, for those of us who grew up in the same era as me, who raised children, you remember James Dobson and the strong-willed child. Okay, that was what we were taught, and how we parented. Okay, we were saying, if our children were disobedient to us, that's a big deal. We got to fix that right away. Okay, nowadays parenting's different. Okay, you don't necessarily talk in terms of obedience or disobedience or any of those kinds of things. I mean, the things that we did, we probably get thrown in jail for now. Okay, but nowadays, it's a different type of parenting. It's a different type of leadership. It's a different type of management that starts to make me think that this whole idea of obedience seems to get tarnished. What do I mean by that? I've been seeing this type of clothing that goes around. And on it, it actually has this one word, obey. Okay? I was like, oh, how nice. They now have clothing that encourages people to obey again. Okay? Whereas obedience wasn't that big of a deal. Okay? And I learned more about what this clothing was all about. And apparently it was developed by a guy who was a street artist. I'm not saying that he did it for the right reasons or wrong reasons or any of that, but he just did it. Okay? And he did it based on a movie, science fiction movie called They Live. And the movie that it's based on is about these people who live in this world where there's actually aliens that live amongst them. Okay, and the only two guys figure it out that there's aliens that live amongst them, because they have these special sunglasses that allow them to see where the aliens are. Apparently they're their leaders, they're government officials, they're all kinds of things. Like aliens have invaded our world, okay? And so we, for the rest of the world who doesn't wear the sunglasses, we blindly obey. That's what it was all about. And so it doesn't really put obedience in a good light. And I think about our culture today, and I think of all the things that are going on in our world today, in all these different areas, and I wonder, is obedience getting a bad name? And I also wonder, though, is it getting a bad name because over time in our history we've had bad leaders that gave obedience a bad name? And I think about that because even just during the window of time within the pandemic, we've seen so many things that have happened amongst leaders, not talking about the outside world, talking about within the church, where we've seen noted authors, Christian authors, and pastors, and more recently, within the last couple of weeks, for those of you who have ever heard of Hillsong Church, okay, their senior pastor just resigned because of some things. And I wonder what has happened is, this whole idea of blindly obeying and getting rid of this idea of obeying at all is because we've fostered a culture that originally started with bad managers and leaders, where when we blindly obeyed, we end up doing the wrong thing. And so I think there's some fault on both sides. There's somewhere in the middle of that obedience spectrum that we need to pay more attention to. And so that's what I want to be able to share with you as we go forward, is that, I don't know. I don't think that we can have a society that doesn't obey at all, that has a mindset within the corporate culture that says, we don't need managers, we don't need to obey anyone, we just do what we do. Or that our kids can just do what they do and we don't have any kind of parenting. The current reality really to me is this, is our society is structured such that authority does exist. The framework of what we believe in the Bible has authority that exists. But those in authority should exemplify servant leadership. And I wonder if that's where we went wrong when we talk about obedience. Not that we don't need obedience anymore, but that the obedience that must be practiced has to be based on people that are leaders that consider themselves servant leaders. I heard something, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it was a business author named Simon Sinek. He said something to the effect that we, as leaders, it shouldn't be about us being in charge, but what it should be about is having care for those we have charge of. You know, and I wonder if there are enough leaders in our society today that are saying, hey, I'm in charge, but it's not about me being in charge. It's about me having care over those that I'm in charge of. Remember when we were parents and our kids, because I hear it now as a grandparent, our kids used to say, when we would tell them to do something, and they would say the magic word, right? Why? Okay? And what was our answer? Because I said so. Right? If you recall, that was how we answered. That doesn't work anymore. Okay, is what I've learned. And so now we've got to come up with better reasons. And, you know, what we see is that it's not a matter of our position anymore. And I think in our society, they do have it right. That there needs to be more to a leader than just because I said so, or just because of the role that we're in. That's how we got into this culture that now defies obedience. But obedience needs to happen. And whether we like it or not, authority exists at home and at school and at work and in sports and in church. If you look at all the sports and you know, competitions that we have, there's still a leader that's there. And I don't think leadership has necessarily gone away, but I think it needs to be redefined so that we have better leaders. So and in having better leaders, we'll have better followers. And so I think it is our ability to obey and be respectful if we disagree is the path we journey towards to our destination. That if we're destined to obey God, and if we're destined for others either to obey us or for us to obey others, is that I think we need to have that dialogue and that mutual respect for if things aren't the way we think they should be, that we have input to be able to say that we don't blindly obey. But it doesn't mean we don't obey at all. So allow me to put obedience back at the most elementary level for us all to understand, well, how do we best practice a culture of obedience? And so I had a dog after I had kids. Yes, I got that right. Yeah, I had a dog after I had kids. And I remember raising my dog. For those of you who have been parents as well as dog owners, you know, boy, there's a lot of similarities that are here, especially when you're raising a dog and you are raising a little child. Okay, and there's a lot of things, but have we ever bothered to dissect what those things are that we've done? And so I'm not saying that as we obey God, we obey God like we do a dog. But there's certain things that fascinate me when you get a dog to obey you as the master. Okay, it takes practice. And I wonder if those same elementary steps of obedience that a dog goes through, and for those of you who've had dogs, you know when they obey you, they're like the most faithful thing, even more so than kids. Okay, and I want to be able to unpack that for you, because I want you to kind of then reflect on some basic elements that I wonder, need to have as we obey our Lord, as we obey others, as others obey us. So I want to show you this video on dog training. When I was preparing this message, I was on a treadmill and I was watching TV, and there was a show called Lucky Dog. And I said to myself, I got to show that. You know, I got to show this clip. So allow me to spend some time to share with you this one clip from Lucky Dog.
These two cues are what I would consider the foundation of the 6 classic cues. Yes. They're usually the easiest to teach because it's very easy to get a dog to follow you if you do have a treat, if they're motivated enough for it.
Dog's name is
He moved
Cheese.
forward, he touched my fingertips. Yes. I then said yes and rewarded with that treat. We did that over and over again until he was consistently touching those fingertips. Then I was able to introduce the word come. Come, sit, yes.
Once Cheese masters the come and sit cues, Eric introduces him to the down cue.
Yes. Good job. Come. Sit. Down.
It's not the professional down, but that's the cute down. I'll take that.
Even though Cheese is feeling playful, he learns the down cue in no time.
Good boy. See if we can start with a stay.
By the end of the session, Cheese has made good progress.
Okay, Cheese. Come. Sit. Yes. Good job.
There are 3 things. Now, as I look at this, I think, you know, because I no longer have a dog anymore. He passed away in, I think it was 2012, around that period. So it's been almost 10 years. And I think to myself, oh, you know, do I ever want a dog again? I'm retired. It's like, no, it was a lot of work, okay, to be able to get him to be where he was at. But if you looked at this video, there were some cues there were some things, elements that he did for the dog to be obedient. He developed a cue, and developing a cue, there was ultimate, and then he practiced it over and over again, and then at the end there was a reward. So 3 things: a cue, repetition, reward. There's a book called The Power of Habit that's out there that is emerging as how we can develop good habits, both at work, in our own well-being, and it's actually very successful. But if you look at the book and you read through it, it's basically the same kinds of things we're talking about here in developing good habits in training a dog. There's a cue, there's repetition, there's a reward. And I think to myself, how are we practicing that good habit of obedience to our God? What's our cue? What's the repetition? What's our reward? So as I close, I want to be able to share with you this, what I consider the principles of obedience. And I think it follows this way, is that in order for us to be able to be obedient to others, whether they're governments or whether they're team sports or whether they're leaders at work, is I think there needs to be some recognition of authority as well as a relationship. I think that's one of the things that managers are learning nowadays. So I don't think the leader will ever go away, but I think the leader will morph into one that is more relatable at work. I was also listening to something in regards to, and of course I know that people fall on both sides of the spectrum in terms of defunding the police or, you know, employing the police to be more equipped. Okay, I get that. Okay, but I want to share with you something that I heard just yesterday, is that there are actually emerging 2 things with the police. Is that police were once considered guardians, okay, and as guardians, for those of you who were in elementary school here in the United States, you remember we used to have a program called the Officer Friendly Program. Policemen would come into your classroom, you would learn this is officer friendly, he was your friend. Okay, apparently, I guess that program has gone away since that time. Is that over time, apparently, and so I don't expect you to be on one side or the other, I'm just trying to explain it. Okay, is that over time, we went from police being guardians, the officer friendlies, to being warriors. So there are actually 2 types of trainings that go on in the police academies now. Is one is what they call guardian training, to be able to foster this whole idea of leaders, that they are leaders and relationships. Apparently back in when they had I think it's in England, they had policemen that were called bobbies. Okay, and what bobbies would do was they would apparently wear their uniform all the time because it showed that they were policemen embedded in the community all the time. That this was their role, whether they were on duty or not. Okay, and that was the whole idea of the guardian mentality, is that you are in charge, you are policemen all the time to watch over, to have care for those that you are in charge. That's the idea of relationship. But over time, there was another emerging type of training amongst police, and that is called the warrior training. Okay, and that was really training them to look out for what things you might have to do. You know, that's when they started ramping up weapons and everything else. Before there was, for those of you who grew up and remember the TV show SWAT, we thought that was like really cool show, because there were only, at the time when we were watching it, there were only like a handful of SWAT teams. Now apparently every police division has their own SWAT team. Okay, and so over time we've kind of militarized, whether it was right or wrong, we kind of militarized the police, and what has kind of diminished is this whole guardian aspect of the training of police academy. So it's been more warrior-like and less guardian-like. And now when they talk about all these things that are happening with the police, really it is, at least from what I can see, it is trying to reinvigorate, re-encourage this whole guardian mentality once again. And I think there is something to be said about that. If we want good obedience, we need good leaders. And police are our leaders. The second thing is to recognize the rules and protocol. In any job that you've had, most likely, if you were a manager, they gave you a big giant book of all the rules of things you do, the things you can't do. Okay, and you try to learn those well. And I wonder for ourselves, what if we didn't have the rules that we have with driving, people would just drive all over the place. Okay, so there's got to be some kind of structure, some kind of rules. And I think to myself, in terms of being obedient to God, what are those rules that should be cues that we would practice over and over again, and that we would be rewarded for? And I think it's this. I think it's the 10 Commandments. I think that's a part of it. And it's also the fruit of the Spirit. And if you if you recall, I did a message where I introduced you my acronym of the 10 Commandments. NOINS, MF, LC, something, MOS LC is what it was. No other, N-O, no other gods before me, no images, no taking God's name in vain, the other N, S, no Sabbath, right? MF stands for mother and father, honoring mother and father. MOS, if you recall, it's because, I remember when Roberto Duran was finding Sugar Ray Leonard, he said, no MOS. That's just for me, right? But I mean, you can think of Christmas or anything else. Murder, adultery, stealing, none of those, right? LC was a high school club that we used to have back at our church. Lying, covetousness. Come up with your own acronym on the 10 Commandments. But as you could see, I was able to say them, okay, because I remember this goofy acronym that I had. But how much do we go over the rules? What is our repetition of our rules and protocol that we have to be obedient to God? And if Palm Sunday is supposed to be the day that weaves together this whole idea of obedience, perhaps maybe that's what we need to practice. We used to have a song on fruit of the Spirit. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. Okay? Right? If you recall that song. What are the things that allow us to remember the things, the protocol and rules that we practice to obey God? So recognize what those things are. And then finally, recognize, just like in the case of training those dogs, right? In addition to the fact that they had a cue and there was repetition, there was a reward. What did he do? He said, yes. And then he'd give him a treat, okay? It seems pretty elementary to talk about a dog in this way, but, like I said, If you read this book called The Power of Habit, basically it's saying if you want to eat better, if you want to exercise better, if you want to do all these things, it requires a cue and some type of reward at the end. And I wonder, as we think about how our obedience happens in terms of our God, do we think about what kind of rewards He's already given us? You know, as I started off embarking on this whole on this whole journey of retirement phase, I've tried to reconnect with my family, and I'll tell you honestly, it is exhausting in some cases. There are elements that often it enters into my mind that, why am I doing this? Why am I always the one that has to kind of be the first one to be out there to connect either my siblings or my friends or all this kind of things? You know, and I think about it, well, maybe that's the sacrifice that I do, and there are clearly rewards, the connections that I'm able to foster because of it, that I just haven't recognized and that I need to recognize. And my hope is that as you look at these things, these elements, and think about your own obedience as we go through this Holy Week is, yes, celebrating our King, but it's also recognizing maybe we need to heighten our practice of obedience. If we do it, remember that simple song when we were kids? Obedience is the very best way to show that we believe, right? And I wonder if we foster a culture of obedience, maybe obedience won't have such a bad name anymore. That as we become the kind of leader, or at least encourage the kind of leader that builds relationships so that people aren't just blindly obeying, that maybe we can foster what God would have intended all along, that we would be folks that would be obedient, and when folks obey us, that we be worthy of that in some way. But as we obey others, that truly we would be able to have that relationship where we can offer some type of feedback that says, I don't know if we're going the right way. And I know that sounds hard, and maybe we don't think that's our place. But, you know, in this generation, in what we're seeing, I wonder if it is our place to be able to embed this whole idea of obedience, reinvigorate it once again within the church, within our community. Let's close in a word of prayer. Our God, we thank you for this time. I perhaps not a normal Palm Sunday message in that regard, but God, as I think about this, this whole idea of obedience is waning, you know, and it's getting a bad name. And I wonder if that's going to hurt us at the end in terms of when we ask people to be obedient to God. And so, God, I pray, Lord, that we would be people that are worthy to obey you, and also that those who obey us, that we would be those kind of worthy leaders. And for us to be able to obey others, that we would be able to hold them accountable by giving the proper input that we would need. And as we think about this practice of obedience and the rules and the protocol and all these things that really the principles of life, how much are we actually looking out for the cues that would allow us to be able to offer some exercise and repetition, and also recognize that you've already given us so many rewards because of our obedience to you. God, I pray, Lord, that we just put in perspective what this was all about, this Holy Week, and that as we ascribe you as King, there needs to be some obedience that has to happen in order for us to be able to ascribe you as such. And so, God, I thank you. I pray, Lord, that our folks would be able to take this message to heart as we go through this week. For us in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.